All right. Welcome everyone to this session titled Rights, Resilience and Sustainability, How Companies Can Build Forward Stronger in the Asia Pacific. This session is co-hosted by the World Benchmarking Alliance, Partners for Review, and the Thai Union Group. Some housekeeping announcement before we start. The meeting today is in the webinar format. We will be recording this session. As participants, you will not be able to unmute or switch your video on. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box below in the Zoom window to type it out. I will relay these questions to our panelists to respond during the Q&A session. The session duration today is 90 minutes. My name is Namit Agarwal, and I am the Asia Policy Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Starting with setting a context for the session today. The SDGs, as you know, have emerged as a framework for businesses and investors to align their operations to the agenda of sustainable development, to grow collaboration with governments, and ultimately for the Asia Pacific region to build back better following COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, the pandemic has emphasized the importance of companies embedding the central principle of the SDGs, leave no one behind. But this can only be accomplished through a social transformation where businesses act ethically, respect human rights, and provide and promote decent work. The 2021 Asia Pacific SDG Progress Report, which was just released a couple of weeks ago, shows that on current trajectory, the Asia Pacific region is likely to achieve less than 10% of the SDG targets. This is alarming. We believe that the private sector has a significant role in accelerating the region's progress on the SDGs. This session aims at identifying current gaps in corporate performance, generating knowledge and insights, and amplifying best practice examples for strengthening the private sector's role in achieving the SDGs. The session is also aimed at informing the VNR or Voluntary National Review processes in the region about acknowledging and accelerating private sector actions and scope in respective national contexts. I'm joined today by an excellent panel of experts who will help us understand these better. I will now introduce all the panelists. Darian McBain, who is a Global Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Thai Union. Thai Union is one of the largest seed processors in the world. Thai Union also ranks top on WBA Seafood Stewardship Index. Darian is on the Global Leadership Team, Risk Management Committee, and Chair of the Sustainable Development Committee. Also joined by Shomo Guha, who is the SDG Officer at Niti Aayog, Government of India. Niti Aayog is India's apex policy think tank. Shomo is a public policy professional with experience in sustainable development goals, framework adoption, integration, and monitoring at the national and subnational level. He has been working with the SDG vertical on efforts towards localizing the SDGs. Also joined by Bhumika Chaudhary, who is a legal research and advocacy lead at CIVIDEP India. CIVIDEP is a civil society organization from India working on issues of labor rights and supply chains. Bhumika is a lawyer, and at CIVIDEP, she specializes in corporate accountability issues and labor rights in the garment sectors. Also joined by my colleague Dan Neal, who leads the social transformation within the World Benchmarking Alliance. The World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA, is an alliance of over 200 organizations creating a global accountability mechanism for private sector's contribution to the SDGs. Dan is responsible for establishing the framework to assess 2,000 keystone actors on core social aspects. We are also here to share perspective from Miriam Rosa, who's an advisor for SDG review at Partners for Review, GIZ. She coordinates the global network, which comprises government representatives, as well as non-state actors involved in national follow-up and review processes of SDG implementation. Interestingly, this year, several countries from this region will be presenting their voluntary national reviews at the HLPF. These countries are Bhutan, China, Indonesia, Japan, Laos, Malaysia, Marshall Islands, and Thailand. Miriam, unfortunately, is unable to join us due to a technical reason. My colleague Iris will be sharing Miriam's presentation on her behalf. Iris is also helping us with the tech today. Iris is the Public Policy Manager at World Benchmarking Alliance. With the introductions, now I would like to start the panel discussion. And Dan, if I can start the discussion with you. There is an increasing global trend of legislation, for example, the mandatory human rights due diligence, et cetera, in several parts of the world. An acknowledgement of social challenges in businesses and deep supply chains. Do you think these trends are enough to help accelerate private sector action on issues such as decent work, sustainable production, inequality, et cetera, or we need something more? What are your thoughts, Dan?
So in a word, no, they're not in of themselves going to be enough. When we look at mandatory human rights due diligence as an example, it's a reflection that 10 years after the UN guiding principles have come out, we know from the assessments that the majority of companies are not doing what they're expected to do under the UN GPs. And we showed with things like the corporate human rights benchmark over several years that while there was change happening, the change wasn't fast enough. This was an advert for the need to raise the bar and introduce legislation which helps, create a level playing field, but also to move things up from the bottom. So the lowest common denominator can no longer, hide as a free rider. So the legislation piece is very important, but not necessarily for driving competition and for driving a race to the top, but very much for having a level playing field for all involved. But there's a lot of caveats that I would say go with it. There's over 30 initiatives that have kind of been running, and whether you think about the California Supply Chain Transparency Act or Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform or import things in America, or if you look at the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Act, or the French Loi de Vigilance, or the potential new laws in Germany and Finland, looking more broadly at human rights due diligence, or the EU-wide mandatory environmental and social due diligence legislation that's being proposed. You'll note they're quite regional centric. And there's some other things that come with that. So even if we do see proliferation of these laws in different parts of the world, and even within blocks like the EU, there are businesses that, and at a national level, that take a slightly different approach towards compliance. And I'll say this quite, relatively carefully, but so if, for instance, in Germany, companies may say, well, if there's a law there, that's fine because everybody will do it. If you're in different parts of the world, they may not be quite the same compliance culture. So laws can only go so far, and it does depend on where you are. And they're also very long process to get there. There's been years of campaigns to get to the point of where the EU is at the moment, and it's still going to take several years for that to really, really come into effect. So if we're looking at 2030 and needing to accelerate, actually it's an important part, but it's a part of the puzzle. The other thing I'd say with these laws, they have to have the right scope. So if they're only looking at your own country, as in companies operating in your country, that's a factor compared to companies that are operating in your country or more broadly in your bloc. And people have pushed back, including John Ruggie, on the German framing, which is on their proposed law, because it focuses on the first tier to begin with. Secondly, they need to be enforced if they're going to be useful. Means the consequences of failure need to actually be significant to encourage companies or to get past that free rider problem. And for that, they need to be monitored. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. But I think if you do have that, if you have a good law with clear rules, a rule following culture with enforcement, and pulled with incentivizing action through civil society, through investors, through consumers, then they can make a real impact in the longer term. I think there is some hope in the form of the EU mandatory due diligence proposals, particularly as they discuss companies that operate in the EU, not just those who have their headquarters there.
Thanks, Dan. It's indeed complicated, and especially when you look in the global environment, and if you start looking at the impact of these legislations in some of the other regions, for example, the Asia Pacific, things definitely become much more complicated. I'll come back to you, Dan, later, and getting your thoughts on how do we come out of this challenge and how do we make some progress. Shomo, if I can come to you next. And India presented its VNR last year and very clearly articulated the role that the private sector has in implementing the SDGs. And from your experience of working on these issues, but also working on the VNR, what are the opportunities and challenges do you think for the private sector to make concerted and accelerated action on the SDGs in a way that leaves no one behind? And also keeping in mind the impact of the pandemic with which everything it's kind of disrupted.
Thanks, Amit. When we started off with the VNR process, it was right about almost a year before the pandemic hit us. And one thing we were clear about this second VNR was that we all know that VNR documents are government-led, but they're not government documents, they're country documents. And therefore, we made a concerted effort to ensure that not only will we have enough participation from civil society organizations, where we had a special focus on 14 population groups. We call them LNOB groups. We also made sure that we had consultations with the private sector. And we also tapped into the energy which was generated around that time on something called the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting Framework, which the government of India was coming out at that point, which is far more aligned to the SDGs. And for the first time, also attempted at trying to build a framework for small and medium enterprises, which are very much integral to the Indian economy and are also who also feed into the larger value chain within the economy as well. So as we were moving on from the VNR and as the pandemic hit us, the 2-3 clear observations that I could see that where a very clear role for the private sector came up. One was, of course, in the immediate term response, which included from the government leading it and creating these empowered groups, one of which was housed here at Niti Aayog, which looked at coordination with the private sector, the civil society, and international organizations. So the kind of challenge which came to us was of the scale where we did not have enough PPE kits in the country around that time. And through cooperation, through partnerships, through building partnerships, we could have a situation where you had through government stewardship, you had private capital looking into essential sort of manufacturing, which could then plug into civil society organizations who could also look into their networks of having their ears closer to the ground. That was, of course, something which happened in the immediate term. In the longer term, if we look at India, the Indian scenario, primarily the push towards SDG alignment or push towards responsible business has been sort of driven by national priorities and therefore, of course, national regulations, global standards, which I think Dan spoke about, consumer consciousness, of course, and investor consciousness. But if there is one thing, I think, and this might be true for the region as well, and where probably organizations like all of us can work on is, of course, whether it is, do we have a clear business case for SDGs laid out in a manner which also answers the harder questions in an economy like, let's say, like India, where during that time, we also had several sort of businesses having discussions with us who were facing challenges of which seemed unsurmountable. Within this conversation, how can we bring in and enforce the fact that SDGs provide us with the kind of framework which can be leveraged to further exactly what you were talking about: decent work, inequality, responsible consumption. And I think these are a couple of areas where it's still work in progress when we talk about this particular region. Thank you.
Thanks, Shomo. And indeed, I mean, I think it's almost 1 year anniversary of the lockdowns that started in India, and how especially the migrant workers and other informal workers were severely impacted from the lockdown. But great to also see that the Niti Aayog has taken the role of private sector in its VNR very, very seriously. And honestly, there are very few VNRs that at least I have come across that articulate the role of the private sector. So it's also an opportunity, as more and more Asia Pacific countries are going to publish their VNR this year, for also them to see, what are the opportunities there and how can private sector play its part. Thanks, Shomo, for that. Bhumika, if I can bring you in, and you and your organization obviously work a lot with workers and in global value chains. In a sense, COVID-19 made the invisible visible, highlighted the systemic vulnerabilities of global supply chains and the conditions within which migrant, informal, and also women workers have been working. If you can just help us understand what is the situation now and how are workers coping with these challenges 1 year on, and what has changed since the pandemic hit?
Thank you, Namit. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone. So I work with Cividep India. We are a labor rights organization based in Bangalore. We conduct research on working conditions and employment relations in sectors that are part of the global value chains, mainly in the garment, electronics, leather, and plantation sector. As Namit said, today marks 1 year since the lockdown as a response to the pandemic, which was announced last year. But long before the imposition of a lockdown in India, lockdowns in major garment importing markets like the US and Europe affected Indian suppliers as early as the month of February. The true extent to which the pandemic and measures to control the pandemic that has impacted businesses and workers are still to be known. It is unfolding even as we speak about it. However, what we do know is that the economy is not doing well. Unlike most low-wage workers, garment workers, a sector that we work in, continue to suffer from job losses. For those who have been able to hold on to their jobs, there is tremendous insecurity about possible job loss. One report which made an estimate says that close to 50% of garment workers were forced to resign from their jobs last year, and businesses scaled down production and running costs. Among other disruptions that took place in the garment supply chain, products that were ready for export were also grounded at the ports. Global brands and retailers under financial pressure began to cancel orders and fail to disburse payments for existing orders. At Cividep, we took several steps to mitigate the condition. So with the funding from an Indian philanthropist, Cividep was able to give rupees 3,000 to 3,000 garment workers. And these were aimed at workers who had lost their jobs and not been re-employed after that. Again, with smaller donations from foreign donors, we helped workers during the most severe period of the lockdown. We distributed dry ration kits and hygiene kits. We also helped some workers get home, and in few cases, we made cash transfers to informal worker groups such as carpenters, zari workers, daily wage workers, and construction workers. As we know, the industry was anyway plagued with poor working conditions, which included high production targets, poor wages, job insecurity, gender discrimination and harassment, inadequate maternity and childcare benefits, lack of freedom of association, and poor access to remedy, amongst other problems. Post the lockdown, working conditions look more bleak. Production targets have increased more than they were before. Workers report working for longer hours without overtime payment. There are frayed relations between employers and employees as a result of increased workload and working hours. The recent breakout by workers at Wistron's iPhone factory to protest against labor violations is an example of that. Labor law reforms that took place in India in the last year will also likely increase an already high informalization trend seen in the sector. Moving on to workers in the garment industry, considering that the garment industry has a highly feminized workforce. So these women anyway bear the triple burden on doing wage work, household work, and care work. One of the biggest challenges that women faced during this period was ensuring that children are cared for when factories reopened. So most garment workers have stopped providing, most garment factories have stopped providing creche facilities. And now these women garment workers have to choose between safety of their children or their jobs. So this is a short background of the situation of garment workers in the pandemic.
Thanks, Bhumika, for bringing that out and also focusing on the impact on women specifically. And I think there are multiple reports claiming that the severity of impact that COVID has had on women workers is just beyond all our imagination. And I hope, I mean, as things are deteriorating in India right now, let's hope that things don't reach another situation of getting into a lockdown or anything. Thanks for sharing that. Darian, if I can come to you next, and you are, a sustainability leader in the region, in the sector. And from your perspective, what are the unique challenges that companies that are operating in your region, in the Asia Pacific region, face on promoting resilience and rights? And within that, how do you think multi-stakeholder collaboration can help drive progress on these issues?
Thank you, Namit, and hello, everyone. Lovely to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I think, COVID-19 and the pandemic we've had has really highlighted some of these challenges that you raise. And in particular, it is about people. So from my perspective at Thai Union, we work a lot on supply chains. We have global supply chains and global markets. And we realized very quickly in the pandemic that if you are not treating your people well, if you don't understand those supply chains, that's when you will have challenges. And I think it is one of the greatest benefits, but also one of the challenges of the region, that there are so many different cultures. They are varied and they are vastly different, and yet they have some commonalities. And so you really do need to have organizations and multi-stakeholder initiatives that can help to bring all of these different people and challenges together. And I think a few of the ones that I've seen over the past year, but ongoing, things like environmental quality and how that impacts a range of different people across numerous different countries. So if we take air quality as an example, if you have fires in Indonesia, the air pollution impacts so many different countries in surrounding area, and that will impact upon the quality of life of those people. If you then look at, for example, climate change and environmental degradation, water shortages, you're starting to see people being put more at risk, and indeed that then leads on to the social risks with an increased risk of migration, people desperate to move, and then that starts to lead you to look at, well, is there ethical recruitment taking place? How are we looking at gender diversity? How can you engage across those different cultures? How can you make sure that we are engaging with small suppliers? And all of these issues come around, and I think having the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals helps us realize that there are commonalities, 17 commonalities of the Sustainable Development Goals that we can work on together. And if I go to the oceans, which is where I spend a lot of my time working with Thai Union, looking at seafood and fisheries, some of the challenges are, for example, plastics in the ocean. This region, well, certainly Southeast Asia is one of the greatest hotspots for plastics in the ocean. Almost 70% of sometimes of those plastics can come from Southeast Asian countries. And those impacts are felt by the people, but also in the environments. And it's only through a global collaborative effort that we are really going to start to look at the packaging, look at the sea gear that's used. So abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear is also a very large part of plastics in the ocean, and help those people to really start to reclaim better quality of life, but a better quality of life for the environment. And then I'd say to look at, the tragedy of the commons. If we don't all act together, then our life quality can really decrease quite quickly. And I think the pandemic in some ways has given us some vision of, we are all in this together. We might be in different countries, we might have different cultures, but here are commonalities. And I would hope we will see the same for major environmental issues like climate change, but also major social issues such as perhaps forced migration and modern slavery. And so in this way, if you have multi-stakeholder initiatives that are bringing together business, but also government, NGOs and civil society, research and academia, governments, different local governments, as well as intergovernmental panels, I think we can start to see some of the solutions that you can have to these global and local problems.
Thanks, Darian, for also bringing in the systems view. And indeed, we are all in it together. And this is a tragedy of the commons. And also thanks for highlighting, I think in all of your opening remarks, you highlighted how a common framework like the SDGs is really building a conducive environment to bring all the stakeholders together. And that's absolutely critical to solve some of these problems which are not restricted to boundaries or sectors or roles. So thanks for sharing that. Time now to hear the perspective from our co-host partners for review. And if I can invite Iris, thanks Iris, to share with us what partners for review have to say on this issue.
Thank you very much, Namit. So I'm presenting on behalf of Miriam Gonzalez. So I hope you can see my screen well.
Yes.
Perfect, wonderful. All right. Sorry, 1 second. Yes, perfect. So let's first start with a brief view of Partners for Review in a nutshell. So Partners for Review is a transnational multi-stakeholder network for a robust review process of the 2030 agenda that Shoma also alluded to before. It's implemented by GIZ in Germany. Their objective is to strengthen the national SDG review processes through transnational multi-stakeholder dialogue and peer learning. They work across 3 thematic pillars: national coordination, both horizontally and vertically, stakeholder engagement, and statistics and data. Their activities include 2 network meetings per year, the creation of knowledge products related to the SDG review and the 3 pillars above, virtual services like on the P4R website and their community and webinars. And they have a review support unit, which is a demand-based bilateral or regional support unit, which includes peer exchanges and data partnerships. So to go quickly into what the VNR processes are, they are the review of the implementation progress of the 2030 agenda at the national and subnational level. And they should be seen as a process, not primarily just a report. It is a state-led with the participation of other stakeholders. This includes civil society and the private sector, but also academia, parliament, supreme audit institutions, media, etc. So the presentation of the reports is every year in July at the UN High-Level Political Forum. But as said, it is a process. The report is to include the status and trends regarding all 17 SDGs and the 2030 Agenda principles, including leaving no one behind and the integration of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, as well as good practices, challenges, lessons learned, and possible needs for support. As a process, there's also follow-up activities after the VNR process, including presentations at national level, further improving data quality and availability, further cooperation with Parliament and non-state actors. So let's look at a couple of statistics here. This is an overview of the VNRs per region. So there's, as you can see here, there's 52 countries in the Asia-Pacific region that have submitted a VNR over the past years. And as Namat already mentioned, there's a couple of countries from the region also reporting on the VNR process this year. So let's have a quick look at the levels of stakeholder participation in the VNR process. So as Shoma also alluded to, there's different levels in which stakeholders can participate in this process and what is facilitated at a national level. And here you see a bit of a differentiation between them. So the first level is to inform, which is a one-way communication from governments to stakeholders. The second is to consult, which is also about receiving feedback from stakeholders. Then there's involving, which means that stakeholders are meaningfully engaged with the VNR process. Then there's collaboration, which means that governments and stakeholders decide together. And the fifth level is empowerment, which means that stakeholders collectively decide on the different issues in the process. So we have a bit of a review here of the stakeholder participation according to those different levels. And as you can see, informing and consulting have been the major ways of involving stakeholders in the VNR process, although collaboration has been increasing since 2019. The private sector and civil society have so far been the stakeholders most involved in these recent years. But then again, there's also, as you can see, there's different levels of stakeholder participation, of course. So let's move to what the private sector can contribute to the VNR process. They can represent the business community during the VNR preparation process and actively contribute to it. So this can be in consultations, sustained and institutionalized dialogue, or multi-stakeholder partnerships. In the 2020 VNRs, the private sector was represented in approximately half of the institutional SDG frameworks and mechanisms. Another thing the private sector can contribute is to fill data gaps. This can be done by providing data from various sources such as telecommunications, social media, etc. And secondly, they can also contribute by disclosing corporate social responsibility and sustainability reporting data in order to use the information to assess business contributions and impacts on the sustainable development goals. Examples of this are also mentioned before, but highlighted here are Bangladesh, Colombia, and Costa Rica. There's also other countries, but they have an SDG corporate tracker to measure private sector contribution to the SDGs. Other things that the private sector can contribute are providing examples and initiatives of private sector contributions to sustainable development and implementing the SDGs. And then fourthly, there is also an opportunity to engage in follow-up activities and monitoring the SDGs, also after the VNR and HLBF forum. So let's have a quick look at an analysis that we have here of the private sector's role in the VNRs. As you can see, the amount of VNRs that consulted the private sector is at 87% in 2020. And the recognition for the need of private sector investment is at 42% and reference to CSR and sustainability reports is at 45%. I'll leave it to you to draw your own conclusions from this, but I think this could be a useful contribution to the discussion. Then I will also make sure that this presentation is shared with participants after the session. Then lastly, on the way forward, so what P4R proposes is to get and stay involved in cooperation with the government and other stakeholders for the VNR process, the follow-up activities and monitoring the SDGs. The private sector can furthermore help get back on track to achieve the SDGs by supporting innovative technologies to rebuild better. This can, for example, be through digital technologies. This has the potential to reignite action for the SDGs. And lastly, we need to scale up initiatives by companies and startups to solve complex issues such as agriculture, water, waste, etc., in order to help address the negative impacts of the pandemic. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention. If there's any questions that you would really like to address to P4R, you can find the email address here. With that, I'll hand it back to Namit.
Thank you, Iris, for sharing this presentation. And if any of the participants have specific questions for P4R, also feel free to put it in the chat box and we can share it with them. It's really unfortunate they couldn't be here in person or virtually, not in person, to present, but I'm sure the message has been delivered. So thanks for that. I will also invite all the participants to put their questions in the Q&A box. There are already a couple of questions that are coming in, but I'll encourage all of you to ask questions. Please mention your name, your organization, and the name of the panelist to which your question is directed. Now we've heard about a lot of the context setting and the challenges in the SDGs in the region and how to get the private sector to engage and contribute to look at some solutions. Now, if I can ask all the panelists to move slightly beyond the challenges and start looking at some solutions, because one of the important objectives of this session was also to look at some good examples so that we can learn and share from each other. And also, if there are questions for some of the other panelists, please also feel free to ask that when you are stating your thoughts on the solutions. And on the solutions, Bhumika, if I can start with you. And given that you mentioned there are quite a few initiatives that CIVIDEP has undertaken in terms of supporting the workers and obviously being part of several multi-stakeholder initiatives as well. If you can share with us, what is that governments, civil society, UN, and the private sector can do specifically working together to highlight some of these best practices and gaps at the national level on SDGs. And I understand that you work specifically on the decent work goal, but you feel free to also look at some of the other issues because it's all interrelated and interconnected. So what are the good practices that you see from your work where all of these stakeholders can come together?
Thank you, Namit. So most of today's pervasive problems, as included in the SDGs, are systemic in nature, complexly interrelated, and materialize at the interface between public-private and profit-non-profit interests. So obviously, these require large systemic change and participatory approaches that include a wide range of societal actors. So what is necessary to make it efficient and operationalize rights for workers or communities on the ground? This can be done by transparent supply chains through mapping and disclosure by businesses of all levels of the supply chain, extending to individual contractors and subcontractors, and disclosure on information pertaining to number of employees along with nature of employment, as well as information on wages paid, which can be a part of financial disclosures. This could help bridge gaps on accurate and reliable data about workers, a gap that was especially evident during the COVID-19 pandemic with the migrant worker crisis in India. Next, that is important is access to remedy and grievance mechanisms, which give voice to individuals and can serve as early warning systems and therefore also become tools for preventing negative human rights impacts. One of the most effective ways to have a credible grievance mechanism is to operationalize freedom of association. If the human right to belong to a trade union is not ensured by the legislation, it amounts to a denial of meaningful labor rights in the form of access to rights to bargain with their employers. So in real terms, what this means is that the third pillar of the UNGPs, which is the access to remedy, is blocked. Any effort towards achieving SDGs will be effective if we recognize businesses as social actors and not just as economic actors that are part of the larger social environment from which they draw resources, which are labor and land. So as social actors, businesses engage in social as well as political activities. And that is something that should be understood when we're looking to collaborate between all these actors. This has significance for its stakeholders and the broader society and communities in which they operate. Businesses should understand their role in shaping the broader social environment and the ways in which their actions cumulatively impact people. As powerful actors that influence both politics and economy, corporations must be held directly accountable for their actions, and this would inevitably mean that regulation cannot be simply viewed reductively in economic terms. If they're viewed as social actors, ethical investment and mandatory regulation will be a logical extension of considering them as social actors. Directly to the question that you asked about some solution where government, civil society, UN, and private sector could work together, we think a pilot project on a specific SDG where all these actors can collaborate and have a joint fact-finding mission, and thereafter come up with recommendations could be useful. Thank you, Nam.
Thanks, Bhumika, for highlighting quite a number of important points, definitely around operationalizing Pillar 3 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also operationalizing and recognizing freedom of association, which is absolutely key, and recognizing workers as social actors and not just economic actors. And then your stress on transparency and disclosure. And that is a challenge, specifically looking at the significantly large informal sector and informal employment in South Asian and other Asian countries. So thanks for raising that. And in fact, last week, there was this South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. And a lot of these issues resonate with speakers from across this region who are talking about lack of transparency and looking at workers in this whole process, and how can access to remedy be strengthened to be able to operationalize the UN Guiding Principles. So thanks, Bhumika, for highlighting some of these very, very pertinent issues. Dan, if I can come to you next, and transparency, comparability, Bhumika spoke about increasing transparency and disclosure. And these are some of the areas in your social transformation work, you're obviously working very, very closely on. And comparability is often highlighted as a key hurdle to concerted efforts to address sustainability challenges faced by businesses, particularly in their operations and deep supply chains, where things get more complicated. How can this be addressed at a regional level? And what are the key leverage points to accelerate this?
So I'm changing some of my thoughts based on what Bhumika's already said. But I think it's worth distinguishing as well. There's two parts. So when you're framing this around a challenge for companies, I think actually, transparency is not necessarily what I would call a challenge for the companies in some respects, because it's more a shift in mindset. Because for a long time, companies have been very happy with a lack of transparency because it's been very profitable. In fact, business models have been set up on opaque supply chains where things are deniable, they're at arm's length, and you don't have to worry about them too much. So there's a slight shift in sort of that bit. Actually, the lack of transparency, which builds into a lack of comparability, is much more of an issue for those who are trying to drive that change and who are potentially the externals or the third parties. Now, leaving aside a small segment of companies that are really driving some of these issues, I think for most people, the lack of transparency and comparability is an issue because they want to make better informed decisions and try and drive some changes within companies and within sectors and within the economy as a whole. So that really is around reporting and disclosure. So if we need that information and we want to look at sort of how to compare with your peers, then yes, a lot of people will say you do need to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges. So things for that, I think we are seeing a move towards harmonization of standards, because national standards are not particularly great for this. We do need supranational standards. If we look at, I think one of the things was mentioned before, and one of the questions came up about reporting things. If you look at the top 100 companies across 52 countries, for instance, 2/3 of them are using GRI already as a sustainability report. But still 20% of these top 100 companies don't report against sustainability whatsoever. So there's these really significant gaps. And these are listed companies. These aren't the private companies and things. So there are still significant gaps on there, but there's definitely a movement towards the harmonization of these, there's been this proliferation, the alphabet soup of ESG reporting and sustainability. I think we are seeing a trend towards disclosure standards. There is a limit to that as well. So disclosure standards tell you what is good to report. They don't tell you what is good behavior. There's a big gap between that. And I think that's where things like benchmarking and the analysis and things that we'd like to do sort of come in. Because yes, you have a framework that says this is all the information you need to report and it's consistent, but then someone needs to put a value judgment on that and say, well, this is better than that, and we're going to reward the company that is better and penalize the company that is worse. And this feeds into that whole approach where WBA steps in, which is to say, we think we can encourage a race to the top, we can penalize laggards, if you like, and then shift the whole sector and the industry at large. And we've been working on the social transformation framework, which is the bit that I work with. I'm just going to share a screen quickly. If everyone can hopefully see a.
Yeah, we can see it now. Okay.
So just so it's interesting when we were talking about the SDGs, because actually we've said for company contribution to the SDGs, one of the key things they can do is just act responsibly. And this ties into what Bhumika was talking about. It all builds on the respect for human rights. So if you're not doing that, then you're going to be undermining your contribution to the SDGs. And then we build the wheel up around these things. This is a list of expectations that we have of companies in order to support the social transformation towards a just and inclusive society that also supports the other systems transformations we need to see for the Sustainable Development Goals. And in there, you've got things like pay fair taxes. All these things are hugely linked. Like, it honestly doesn't matter about a specific SDG strategy if your company isn't paying its fair share of tax. And so I think for a lot of the stuff when we talk about build back better, I get a bit concerned when I see things like technological solutions, when actually we wouldn't need to build back better if companies were already meeting their basic responsibilities to act as good corporate citizens. And so the framework we're pushing and what we're going to try and do over the next 10 years is to move companies to meet these basic responsibilities, because we think they fundamentally underpin and enable the broader transformations needed for the SDGs. Part of that is we take this from publicly available data, we base it on internationally accepted standards, and part of that conversation to drive the standardization of reporting and the standardization of interpretation of the reported data, so we can all agree on what is good and what is not good, and then be part of that conversation to improve the amount of data that is put into the public domain and try and shift, as Bhumika was saying, from this economic purely actor to a social actor and actually have a joint conversation around it. So I think there's a lot to be done on that. I think from a regional perspective, it's almost leapfrogging the regional piece and going straight to the global perspective. We have internationally recognized financial reporting standards. We need internationally recognized sustainability reporting standards, so we can all have a similar conversation, improve transparency and disclosure, encourage that race to the top and identify the laggards, and build that in so that the market actually recognizes good and bad performance on sustainability, which will in turn drive and support the SDGs more broadly. Just stop my screen share.
Thanks, Dan. And I think your message is loud and clear that go back to the basics, and once companies are able to meet the basic requirements, other things can also come in place. But also thanks for sharing the diagram. And you said you are going to assess 2,000 global companies and getting them to move up on the ladder on these critical issues. So all the best for that. I think that's a very, very critical and an important thing in the current context. If I can come to you next, Shomo, and in the policy world, how can policy interventions help to promote resiliency? And you heard from Dan that there are a lot of policy actions happening in different parts of the world. There is a need for harmonization. And I believe India is in the process of harmonizing its own policy actions on responsible business. But how can these policy interventions help to promote resiliency and protect against future shocks based on what we have learned? And some of these are obviously very, very critical to prevent any issues, further ramification on social inclusion issues in the country.
Thanks, Amit. I think if you again look back at the way the pandemic unfolded in the country and to the sort of government response which took place simultaneously, I think there are a lot of learnings here. And one of the first few things which one would notice is that whenever there was a solid foundation base, whether it's systems, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's networks, whether it's partnerships, which preceded the pandemic, that is where we did relatively better. So if I look back absolutely at public service delivery, we did better at cash transfers because we worked on bank accounts. We did better at clean cooking fuel during the pandemic because we worked on that. We're right now doing better on vaccine manufacturing because there is a particular manner in which the government has steered it and the private sector has also responded. So wherever there has been a solid foundation which preceded the pandemic, we've done well. On the other hand, this was also one of the very few times when we had to also simultaneously not only look at the immediate impacts, but also work towards longer term challenges. So again, if I go back to public service delivery, if you look at the union budget, which came out this time around, it was significantly different. It had acknowledgements and allocations on healthcare of the kind which probably wouldn't have happened had the pandemic, if the pandemic hadn't happened last year. So similarly, on those lines, I think one of the key areas where I see a lot of conversations in India taking place increasingly as a result of the pandemic and because there is more interest is around sustainable finance, is around blended finance, which I'm sure you'd agree 5 or 6 years ago were conversations which were probably not taking place. So on that front, there is a lot of breaking of silos and forging of partnerships at a level where the government can play a steering role and sort of encourage explorations where we can have. So one of the things that also happens in this, especially in this area, is you have sometimes regulators, stock market regulators working on similar things. You have particular ministries working on regulations, and then you have someone like us who work on the overarching SDG framework. So what I see now, thanks to the really real difficult ramifications of COVID-19, is that there is more coherence in this conversation and the direction in which we are moving. Thanks.
So Shoma, just on the point around coherence, we do see a lot of coherence building up at the national level. And just wanted to get your sense in what is the role of national governments and how can regional bodies in the Asia Pacific or more wider, how can national governments play a role in aligning efforts more regionally and globally around policy coherence, whether it's sustainable finance or sustainability in general or supply chain issues?
Thanks. So I do see again, and this building up especially after the pandemic, but on a larger level, there are a lot of strategic. I think there's a need to understand and also focus on the strategic sort of compulsions of the countries in the region, and then build from there. Collaborate with actors who also are part, who also understand the importance of the broader need for such collaborations, and finally it's also very important to communicate through measurements. So, for example, in today's discussion, we spoke about how, and it's also part of the concept note as well, that how the region is falling behind. And if we can focus on, quicker evaluations, measurements, and therefore communication, we can probably impress upon the scale of the challenges and communicate to the countries especially and to the various stakeholders, and then sort of emphasize on the importance of why such a collaborative approach is required. So if that makes sense, Namit.
Thanks so much, Shoma. That's very helpful. And with that, if I can come to you, Darian, and you spoke about the systems view in your opening remarks, and now we are coming quite closely clustered around a systems view and integration. Many of the challenges that we have been discussing so far are on, wider systems. It's not necessary of a certain stakeholder or a certain category. And it requires several stakeholders within a sector and also outside to work together to address these. What are some of the solutions that seem to be working for your sector, which is the seafood sector?
Thank you, Namit. It's an interesting question because there are multiple different multi-stakeholder initiatives, but one I'll speak about today is called SEABOS, which is Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. And it's unusual because, one, it was set up to deliver against the Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG 14, Life Below Water, really is the foundational aspect of this. But also it's a collaboration between business and academia. And that really is who was at the round table. And it came from a paper that was published in PLOS One in 2015 by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And they took the concept of keystone actors from environmental science, and they looked at the seafood sector to see who were the biggest companies who were really had control, perhaps some level of control over the sustainability outcomes for the oceans. So they analyzed many different companies and they came up with 13 keystone actors. And normally that is where academia then rests. The paper got published in a tier 1 journal and that would be it. But the Stockholm Resilience Centre decided to take it further. And so they went to bring everybody together. And now 10 of those companies, so 10 of the largest seafood companies in the world, are working together under the auspices of SEABOS. And what is interesting is it's got companies from wild capture, so that's fishing, from aquaculture, which is more of the farming that happens for seafood, and also the feed, because you have wild capture aspects for feed, which then go into aquaculture. So they're all very integrated. And it's all brought together under the auspices of Her Royal Highness, the Crown Princess of Sweden, who is an SDG ambassador. So from this aspect, you've got companies from Norway, from Japan, from Thailand. It really is global. You've got all of these scientists and different academic institutions who research the priority topics. So looking at things like traceability and transparency, looking at ending modern slavery, ending illegal fishing, looking at plastics and the impact both on the fish, but also on the oceans. And it really is an interesting collaboration. There's also a high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, which is finding some amazing things like that the oceans are likely to contribute around 21% of the reduction in greenhouse gases that will contribute to the ultimate, hopefully, limiting of the changing climate by 1.5 degrees C. And so that collaboration is interesting. We've had many meetings throughout this region. We've met in the Maldives, in Japan, in Thailand, as well as in Europe. And it's about focusing together on what we can do. And it does also link slightly to the World Benchmarking Alliance Seafood Stewardship Index. So many of the companies who are part of SEABOS are also captured within the 30 companies that are analyzed as part of the Seafood Stewardship Index. So it was very interesting to hear what Dan was saying about rewarding the best performers, bringing up the laggards. In a sense, that's what CBOS is doing, making sure this group of the 10 largest seafood companies move together towards better practice, continuously improving. But because our supply chains are global, and indeed our markets are global, that should actually have a cumulative effect on whichever of the SDGs we are looking at. And it could be gender equality, it could be decent work and economic growth, it could be ending hunger. There are so many different SDGs that we look at. So I think that approach of bringing together multi-stakeholders in one industry, so in this case, seafood industry, with academia who can research, well, what are the key things that you need to do to make change, is a really interesting perspective, but then also that link to the global issues around the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're about 3 years into the collaboration, and I guess it's a matter of watch this space to see how those outcomes change, but they're about to start working on something specifically in Asia Pacific and looking at tuna, because tuna as a fish species, a migratory fish species, it touches on so many countries in this region, whether the fish will migrate through territorial waters or international waters, where the vessels will be fishing, where the fish is processing, and of course, ultimately, how people are getting their protein globally.
Thanks, Darian. That's a fantastic example of collaboration within a sector. Just a quick follow-up on that. What potential do you see for collaborative models like this at a regional level, but also in some of the other sectors? So is there potential to replicate this in other sectors as well?
There is, and so the Stockholm Resilience Centre have subsequently done research on those keystone actors in numerous different sectors. So one study I think was just across the oceans, because then you have logistics and transport, you have deep sea mining, you have tourism, all different sectors that rely on the oceans, but also looking at a more commodity base. And they've apparently been approached by some other commodities to say, can you do this kind of collaboration in our sector as well, because it's seen as being quite a unique and hopefully successful model.
Thank you so much, Darian, for that. And it's now time to take a few questions from our participants. And I think the first question is addressed to Shomo and Darian, but I think, it's quite broad, and any of the panelists can choose to respond to this. And this is about how can companies be engaged in promoting sustainable development, particularly on environment, social, and governance. So on all the 3 ESG indicators. So what can companies do to engage on ESG in promoting sustainable development? So quite a wide question. So I don't know if, Darian, do you want to start first, because it's addressed to you, and then I'll invite others to also chip in.
Sure. Well, I'll answer one aspect of it. And from my perspective, it is showing by doing. So it is great to be able to provide an example that acting in a sustainable way, looking at environmental, social, and governance issues can be part of a leading business, and for Thai Union, a business based in Asia, and that it actually still works as a business model. The Thai Union corporate impact is still continuing to grow, the company continues to grow, but we really are trying to lead with sustainability. And that's more than fine words. It's more than just putting policies in place and saying we like the SDGs because they're colorful. It is about having an impact on people's lives for the social aspects. It's about being able to measure the change in the environments in which we're working in, hopefully for the positive, but actually taking those measurements. And I think another panelist also mentioned that you need to be able to measure your performance. And it's about setting up the governance systems, which may be within your own organization, but also need to link to governments that you're working with, perhaps other industry stakeholders as well.
Thanks, Darian. Anyone else who would like to respond to this question?
Well, it does address me, and it refers to Niti Aayog as a company. But yes, we do our bit. In fact, it gets me back to the presentation we saw on the VNR. Uh, and as a follow-up to the private sector engagement and the consultations that we held with them, we're doing 3-4 projects. One is on sustainable finance, which we are doing with Ministry of Finance. We're also looking at creating sectoral impact matrices, matrices which can guide us towards measuring impact, sectoral impacts. We are looking at 3 to 4 sectors right now. The project, I spoke to Namit once about it. It's still initial days. And of course, the third one is we are looking at, again, a lot of generation of awareness and communication and trying to come out with a report which documents the proceedings of the consultations of the VNR and kind of makes a business case for the SDGs. So yeah, these are some of the things that we are working on. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Shoma. Dan, I see you're off mute. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the phrasing of it, which is how can the companies be engaged in promoting sustainable development, particularly in environmental and social governance. I think one of the things we've got in our wheel of cheese of the red is really around responsible lobbying. And I think for a long time, you know, a lot of companies have focused very much on lobbying and political influence as a way that they can adjust the legislative landscape to better their company objectives, if I put it politely. And I think there's a step now. If we look at the hundreds of millions that the oil and gas industries, for instance, have put into lobbying, just in North America, as an example, if 10% of that budget was shifted towards lobbying for progressive things for the SDGs, there's a bit of a mindset shift there for companies, which is to say, we think we're a responsible company, but we know there's only so much we can do on our own. You know, if we talk about what Darian was talking about there in terms of bringing companies together to actually take part in that, I think lobbying is a big piece of that. We've seen it in the EU, where groups of companies have come together to lobby to say we need more progressive legislation because there isn't a level playing field. We need more progressive disclosure standards because we don't have comparability and we don't have transparency. So I think that there is an open door for companies to step into there, and it shifts things away from these silos in a company where this is the sustainability department and this is what they deal with, and here is the government relations department and this is what they deal with. But actually coming together and bringing those two things together to speak to the same thing and linking it to the SDGs, I think is a really useful opportunity.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll take another question, and which is around, we spoke a lot about measurement. So this question is on how do we track the involvement of private sector in the VNR, but also I would expand it to broadly SDGs. And Dan, earlier you mentioned about GRI and also CDP reporting frameworks, but what is a preferred framework to measure the involvement of private sector in VNR or SDGs? Shoma, if I can come to you with this one, is there a thought that you have in Niti Aayog in terms of how do you track the engagement of private sector in India?
So if you, again, July 2020 is when we, Ministry of Commerce, in fact, came out with the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting Framework. And they majorly sort of wanted to create a framework not only for the larger companies, but also SMEs, which is also important. And that particular document lays out, of course, GRI, then integrated reporting. They also, of course, talks about CDPs, and in addition to that, also elements of SASP, Sustainability Accounting Standard Board. So these were a couple of sort of frameworks that we looked into when it came down to BRSR. But if it's for a VNR on a national level, and if we are looking at reporting numbers, how we report numbers for nationally, which are government led or government statistics led, it's a challenge. It's a challenge because you do not, it's not a household survey form of aggregate statistics. These are industry statistics or large aggregate numbers. So for example, it can probably answer sectoral trends. You can get sectoral trends. You can get industry scale related trends, but to get aggregate numbers to report at the VNR, it's a challenge.
Thanks, Shoma, for accepting that. I mean, it is challenging to look at the contribution of the private sector in some of the aggregate numbers. I'll take one more question, and which is around when you look at, and this question is from an Indian context, that while there will be a few companies in each context, I believe, who would be taking sustainability very seriously, but it's still not a critical mass. And unless there is a push from either a financial market, sustainable investor, or if these are development banks who are funding these projects, things don't generally move. So if I can open that question, starting with you, Darian, if you want to jump in on that, what can we do to make sure that there is a critical mass and it's not just a few sustainability leaders who are doing this, but we can also get the fence sitters and the laggards to move?
So I think this is where governments and regulation need to come in. It's interesting that as a business, we are often asked to continuously push the boundaries. So it might be on social issues, it might be environmental issues, but ultimately there's only so far a business can go if you don't have that regulatory framework. We are a business, we will have a purpose for our business. It might be making profit, it might be for purpose, but you still need to have governments engaged. And it was interesting, I think, picking up on, again, what Dan said, we do get involved in advocacy, but for higher levels of regulation and standards, particularly with the oceans, we see fisheries are failing because there is a lack of governance, and that is by governments, not by industry. Industry can't be the regulator. Industry should be the ones following the regulation, and you need to have the penalties of breaches of regulation, and you need to have regulation that is smart and effective that will drive positive change. And so, yes, it's important, I think, for the bigger industry players or the more influential ones to come together to positively advocate for improved environmental standards, because really, once you're one of the biggest in your industry, I find that you will be hit with whatever sensational news or negativity comes out anyway. You tend to be trying to operate at the best practice level, but it's the many smaller players who nobody has heard of, don't make it into social media, who can get away with playing at that lower level. And that's why I think you need regulation to bring up the bottom, but then you also need leaders in an industry to drive change and show that it's possible and share those lessons learned. And I think, just picking up on the frameworks, the UN Global Compact has a good framework in the local Global Compact networks, in that they specifically allow for the larger businesses to engage with smaller businesses and share some examples of, well, this is how we did it. You know, maybe you can work along a similar way.
Thanks, Darian. If I can ask Dan, and then Bhumika, maybe, how do you get the smaller companies in supply chains and others to join in?
Because I really reinforce what Darian was saying there, I think, and it's particularly important to note that the tall poppy problem. You know, the tallest poppies get chopped down first, and there, for a lot of good companies, there is a first mover disadvantage. So if you can be huge like Unilever and you can set out your stall and you can distinguish yourself, that's fine, that's great. But we have the problem of a lot of companies are very happy to hide in the average. You know, if the average score is really low, that's okay because everyone else is in the average. And they would like to shift. I think a lot of companies would like to do better, but if they see it as, you know, financially disadvantaged to behave more responsibly, then they're not really going to market theory would say they won't necessarily take that route. It's not part of their USP to be the best on sustainability, so they can quite happily be in the middle. And we've seen where companies are campaigning because they do want a level playing field, because they're fed up of the free riders, those who don't follow the minimum voluntary standards, and therefore are rewarded by the market for that. So that is a real push, I think, to raise that legislative bar and to bring those bits in. But it's definitely you've got a pull at one end on the leading companies, and you've got a push at the bottom from the lagging companies. So it's always going to be this mix of third-party non-legislative pressure and legislative pressure to get things to improve. Sorry, hand over to Bhumika.
Thanks, Dan.
I
Bhumika?
think most has been said by Dan and Darian. So I think one thing that could also be looked at is educating these businesses. I mean, a lot of times they're aware of regulations, but the information is not enough for them, or they don't see the business sense in implementing those regulations. And I think if they're given a business case to do that, and if they're given sufficient information on how it affects things at the global level, or how their business or trade will get affected in the long term, I think that could make sense to them, and they would be more inclined in implementing those regulations.
Thank you, Bhumika. And yeah, I think there are a couple of more questions, but I think we can move on to the last part, because I'm also conscious of the time. And what I'm going to do now is invite all the panelists for some final closing comments. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that as a region, Asia Pacific, we are not doing too well on the SDGs. And obviously there are a lot of challenges to bring us back on track. I wanted to ask each one of you in your closing comments to give everyone some hope. So tell us what gives you hope that we will be able to get there by 2030, and we will be able to achieve the SDGs. And I can, if any of the panelists wants to volunteer and start with their thoughts. Shoma, can I invite you to kickstart?
Sure. I'm sure like a lot of conversations, like again, going back to the pandemic, one of them which took place was about recasting the SDGs. A lot of papers on the same which came up, but at the end of the day, it again goes back to the point that now is the time to probably double down on them, if that's possible, because honestly, great feats are rarely a product of like any sort of moderate or lowered ambition. And this is also a time where I feel, especially as part of a policy think tank which works closely with the government, a time to look really hard at some of the questions which we probably wouldn't have addressed previously. And that has sort of, with heightened alertness, has propelled the trajectory towards the SDGs. I see more and more state governments involved these days, which is something, again, 3 or 4 years back, subnational governments and their interest towards the SDGs wouldn't be the same. And I see the motivations being different this time around. I also see a lot of interest in ESG investing for that matter, a lot of interest in sustainable finance, a lot of interest in seeing also business sense in ESG investing. Reading daily that, the ESG Nifty index is outperforming the Nifty 50, and so on and so forth. Something also I think Bhumika alluded to as well, that there is, I think we've kind of also reached a point where more and more we'll see a take up, and I think that has been quite encouraging, especially from actors who probably 4 or 5 years ago wouldn't be as involved as they are today. Thanks.
Thanks, Shoma. Dan?
Yeah, and to come in. I think it feels a little bit sometimes like you're on the side of the mountain with all the pebbles coming down. Like there's not an avalanche yet, but there's lots and lots of pebbles. Apart from everyone at the bottom of the mountain, don't worry about them for now. But the idea that there are lots of these little bits that are starting to roll and starting to move, and they, like as Shay was saying, they cut across lots and lots of different sectors. You know, going from I don't want to give too many plaudits to certain things, but you know, the shift in tone from groups like BlackRock, from the insurance sector itself, the recognition, you know, if one thing I think that COVID has kind of opened eyes up to a little bit is that actually, do you know what, 100% efficiency and a zero resilience just-in-time supply chain doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And people are actually really, really important. And the other thing I think has been fantastic that gives me hope is we're at the end of 4 or 5 decades of Chicago School, Milton Friedman-esque, roaring in tooth and claw capitalism. And then all of a sudden, governments around the world have stepped in and go, you know what, actually, you do need big government. You need governments that are going to step in. And we're going to sacrifice the whole of the economy for a whole year in so many countries to save the lives of people. And that gives me huge hope that we do have political and social will to make big changes in times of crises. And I think that's very necessary because there's 3 massive crises looming on the horizon. So yeah, that's I try to think really hard about what gives me hope, and I think it's some of those things.
Thanks, Dan. Bhumika, do you want to come in next?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the whole new liberal globalizing era saw businesses opening their economies, and so in a process, a lot of workers' rights, at least I'll speak about my field, that got diluted. But now we're happy that developed countries see value in getting into those debates, seeing how their policies affect policies and economies in developing countries. So as in when there would be more laws like MHRDD or other laws and policies that affect developing countries, I think businesses would become more sustainable, would start looking at their working conditions, etc. And I think that also gets translated in how governments, civil society organizations in developed countries work with civil society organizations in developing countries. So all the multi-stakeholder institutions that have come up in the last few years, I think they're very effective in solving a lot of problems in global supply chains. I think, yeah, the more we collaborate, I think the more problems we will be able to solve.
Thanks, Bhumika. Darian?
Well, I think we need to take Bhumika's last line as the end of the conversation, that the more we collaborate, the more we can solve problems. I think that's a lovely summary. I would agree that I think the shifts in finance and investments and insurance are starting to have an impact. In that sense, follow the money. And the money is now saying you need to be responsible. You know, the announcement by BlackRock this week was, you know, quite significant to say they're going to ask businesses to look at their risk models for business human rights. We're seeing more messaging like that coming out of more investment organizations, and particularly the longer term ones. I know I have those discussions with longer term investors. We've seen shareholder action, which really is asking companies to walk the talk that they have been putting out. Seen that in Australia with companies like Rio Tinto, who lost their chief executive and 2 board members over really their social license to operate in one of their mining operations in Australia. I think that gives me hope, but also I'm naturally an optimist. I think for all of the countries in this region, and indeed all the companies, there is something for everybody that they can all identify with within the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the secret is to start, where you can see it makes sense, and it makes either business sense or governance sense. And then that snowball effect of, oh, this is possible, and we can move on to more. The more we collaborate, the more we can see how we can make some more change. And I think it's the snowball effect. Let's hope the heat doesn't get the snowball before it really starts to form. But it is the collaboration and to see these changes are possible, and it is possible for business, governments, and civil society to work together to have better outcomes.
I'll just try to do a quick summary. It will be impossible for me to do justice with a thorough summary. But I think what came out very clearly was the role of regulations and government in raising the baseline and bringing the laggards and the fence sitters closer to some of the sustainability leaders, identifying communities and workers as social actors and not just as economic actors. Cooperation and collaboration was very, very loud and clear, but particularly with unusual allies. That great example about companies and academics working together and doing some innovative work. We definitely need a lot of ambition, going from less than 10% to 100% in less than 10 years, working with all of the stakeholders and leveraging voices of investors, but also some of the other trends, whether these are civil society movements or worker voices that are coming in, and also leveraging the ripple effect of global legislations. Some of you mentioned the mandatory human rights due diligence and how can that have an implication and influence countries in this specific region, of course. And also important to make sure that we do get the basics right before we are looking at innovative and technological solutions, making sure that we have enough data, transparency, and that. So thanks once again, all the panelists and the participants. This session was recorded, so we will create a summary and also put out the recorded version on our social media and YouTube channels so that the message can go to a much more wider audience and also help other countries and other stakeholders who are in the process of developing their voluntary national review or having their own strategies on contribution to the SDGs to learn and share from this. So thanks so much for spending your time with us and sharing some insightful thoughts with all of us. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Iris, for making sure the technology works and we were all able to have this conversation.
Great. Thanks all. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.